Know the story behind that song?
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it a great story? You don't know it? It came out of Bethel Church, I think. There was a young boy that, Jen, you might have to help with the details, that had contracted a disease that was believed to be fatal. And so the whole church went into prayer, and the guy who wrote that felt that the Lord prompted him to write that song in the middle of it, that we would raise a hallelujah in the face of what appears to be an inevitable tragedy.
Yep.
And the result, not only of the song, but of much prayer, of course, was that that young boy came through and was healed. So it's a fantastic story. It's a real faith-building song, isn't it? We've got to praise God and sing a little louder over and above all the issues that our lives face.
And
because He's a good
best
God.
part of that is above and beyond our unbelief.
Yes. Yes, that's right. That's right. That's the extraordinary thing, is it, with the you to push your unbelief aside and say, Lord, I believe in who you are and what you've said and what you've promised, and I'm going to stand on that. And I'll share a bit more about that tomorrow morning, actually, during the church service. Okay, so I've picked up a couple of old slides, and I realised I didn't actually change the title. It was just meant to be most asked questions, and I've had a whole bunch of questions come in, not specifically who made God, interestingly enough, but that is a question that's often asked. And in fact, it's one that is trotted out often by people who attack Christianity and say, well, if God made the world, then who made God? In fact, it was a question that Richard Dawkins raised and others. So I might just touch quickly on it, but now that I've raised it. I've got several other questions that came in. I have written questions, some from Hannah, some from someone on a bit of paper, so I don't know who wrote those, and various people have come to me and asked things, and I've picked up some questions, a couple of comments you made last night, Hannah, that I've also tried to pick up as well. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about can be found in this book, the Creation Answers book. And if you haven't got a copy of this, I'd really recommend it. It's like getting hold of a mini library. It's got 20 chapters in it that are quite short, and it addresses the most asked questions that Christians and non-Christians alike tend to have, including, does God exist? In fact, that's the very first chapter. Chapter 1, does God exist? And so this question about who made God, let me just trot quickly through it, because you will probably encounter it if you haven't already. This is claimed to be the sort of the atheist's number one argument. And this is Philip Adams, a speech down here at a conference in Melbourne, said the great argument for God was that there had to be a creation, a beginning, but my objection was simple: if God was the beginning, who began God? And interestingly enough, that's also the argument that Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, used in his book, Why I'm Not a Christian. So it's a good question. Do you know how to answer it? And we need to be equipped. Remember what 1 Peter 3:15 says? Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you the reason for the hope that you have. Let's say you're wandering around in the countryside and you come across this old car, and you look at it and you realise that even though it's rusting away, there was a time in the past when it was brand new, shining, rolled off the production line. It had to have had a beginning. Okay? So we see it there running down. It's not yet totally disappeared. It must have had a beginning. The same is actually true of the universe. It began too. The universe is winding down. The stars are burning up all their thermonuclear fuel. The energy is being dissipated everywhere. Cosmologists tell us that we will be facing a heat death, which will be when the whole of the universe is all at the same temperature, no further work can be done by anything, any mechanism, and it will all end. But it hasn't yet run down. So it must have begun, just like the old rusting car. And an interesting article published in New Scientist a while ago, the death of the eternal cosmos. Some people are arguing maybe matter was eternal, it's always been here. But this headline here says that all space-time can't possibly be eternal in the past. there must be some kind of boundary, or at least a beginning. And of course that beginning today is the Big Bang. So that's not a Big Bang, that's a chair. And so I want to use the analogy of the chair to talk us through the logic of this. Now the chair that you're all sitting on at some stage or other had a beginning. So if it began, it means that it must have been made. There's a law in science called the law of cause and effect, and it basically says that for every effect there must be a sufficient cause, or everything that had a beginning must have a sufficient cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore it too must have been made by exactly the same logic. The chair, the maker of the chair rather, was independent of the chair. The chair didn't make itself. It's impossible for something to make itself. That's quite irrational. So the maker of the space-time universe must similarly be independent of space and time. So therefore it must be supernatural, outside of the natural universe, and must be eternal, outside of time. If the maker of the universe is eternal, he has no beginning and no end. So if he has no beginning, he requires no maker. So God is an eternal, self-existent being. That's how he describes himself in his word, the Bible. See, if God had a beginning, there must have been a greater God that made God. And if that was true, there must have been a greater God that made the greater God that made God. And so you work your way back in this infinite regression, which is meaningless. So an essential attribute of God is that he has no beginning. So asking who made God is a little bit like asking who is the bachelor's wife. Now, if you think about it, it's an impossible question, isn't it? Because a bachelor, by definition, doesn't have a wife. And if someone has a wife, he can't be a bachelor. So the question is actually meaningless because it fails to recognise what a bachelor is. So to say who made God is actually a meaningless question. It fails to recognise one of the fundamental characteristics of God. So I worship the creator of all things, not the creation. I don't worship a created thing, I worship the creator of all things. Professor Paul Davies summed this up rather well. He said, the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. Often people will say to me, you Christians just believe by faith. But the atheist actually has to have a considerable amount of faith, because he actually has to believe that nothing became everything all by itself with no agency of creation. I believe that rather everything came out of nothing, but there was a creator that did it. See, that's logical. There's a creator involved. But if there's no creator, it's not logical at all. Okay, another question that came up, or several actually. What about distant starlight? We look at these galaxies and things that are billions of light years away. Surely that means that the light must have taken billions of years of travel time to reach us. How then can the creation be only 6,000 years ago? How does that work? Another way of asking the question is, how did God create the universe so big in such a short space of time? So, an example, for instance, you have the Large Magellanic Cloud. Back in 1987 there was a supernova there. That's 170,000 light years away. The Andromeda Galaxy is 2.5 million light years away, and if we see them. So, how are we able to see that starlight of the Earth is only 6,000 years old? So, let me just make a couple of points first about this whole question of distant starlight. First of all, the creation week was a week of miracles. God is speaking into being things that did not previously exist. Now that's a miracle. And that means that we would be therefore limited in the extent to which we would expect to understand the mechanism of the miracle. Because it was a one-off event. is not repeated. We can't see what happened. And so, do we really think that we're going to be able to figure out what God actually did? Well, I don't think that we've really got much of a chance. Except to say that God's way of operating seems to be to lay down principles and then build upon them. So when God builds the laws of physics, which must have been in place on the first day, it seems reasonable he would have employed those laws of physics, at least to some degree, in the subsequent days of creation. So we recognise a miracle because it overrides the normal laws of physics which govern the regular operation of the universe, right? Otherwise we wouldn't know that a miracle had happened. If you think about it, if everything that happened was miraculous, we would have no idea of how the universe worked. Science would be impossible because nothing would be repeatable. But because God made a regular, organised and ordered universe, we can in fact recognise miracles. And of course we should note that God is not constrained by the laws of physics he instituted. So, tucking those things away as a backdrop, let's look at this question. Now there are various biblical creation models that have been developed to address this distant starlight question. I want to share one of them, but just to let you know that there are several. And the category I want to talk about are time dilation models. Now, we think of time as being a constant throughout the universe. And in our experience, there's no connection between space and time. So if I'm at the other side of this property, my watch ticks at the same rate at which your watch does in this room. There's no difference. But that's not true on a cosmological scale. It's also not true when we move away from the Earth, because time, in fact, does vary and it flows at different rates depending on different things. All of this became evident as a consequence of Einstein's general relativity theories, which were then developed to predict these things, which have been shown experimentally to be true. So the mechanisms proposed produce considerably more elapsed time in the outer edges of the cosmos than on the Earth. So the universe, according to the Bible, the sun, moon and the stars were created on day 4, and God stretched out the heavens, the Bible tells us. So the sort of picture that we get is on the 4th day of creation, God creates the heavenly bodies, the sun, moon and stars, which would include the planets, and presumably on that day, or maybe starting earlier, but certainly on that day, God stretched out the heavens to their vast extent. And there's a little phrase in the scriptures that says, "and it was so," which implies that that action was completed. We find it repeated several times in Genesis chapter 1. And it was so. So God speaks and his word accomplishes its purpose. It's done, right? Now, interestingly, if you take a clock to the top of a high mountain, it actually, an atomic clock say, it runs faster than an identical clock at the bottom of the mountain. Now that's counterintuitive to us, and the difference is not great, by the way. If you're up on a mountain, let's have a look. A clock at 1600 metre altitude will run faster than a clock at sea level by 5 microseconds every year. Okay, so it's not like it's a big deal. So if you're thinking of wanting to live longer, move up to the mountains, that's not going to really help you much, right? But when you move a long way away, it does have an effect. For instance, the GPS satellite system that you'll all be familiar with relies on a time correction factor to be able to determine your position. And the time correction is due to time dilation. So they're at about 20,000 kilometres altitude, and at that altitude the clocks run at a different rate than atomic clocks on the surface of the Earth. So the point about this is that gravity actually distorts time. Now we don't notice that in our own life, but we can see it at a cosmological level. Here's the GPS satellites. It's actually quite a significant effect. There's a Doppler shift as well because it's moving. That's a relativistic mechanism, and also a gravitational time correction there. It's quite big. You see 42 microseconds a day. Now if you don't correct for that, the position that your little sat-nav system gives you on the screen the error will increase at the rate of about 400 metres every hour. Now, if you think about that, you've only driven for maybe 5 or 10 minutes and you're going to be off the road, and then 10 minutes later it's trying to tell you to turn around and go back, and it's lost, it can't match a road, and it'll be a completely useless system. So little sat-nav is doing some clever corrections. Actually, the corrections are mostly done on the spacecraft, as it turns out.
So
Yes,
what
Tom?
he was showing us earlier on, there's all these moons and stuff going around each other.
Yeah.
So there must be, all the gravitational pulls are changing and changing, and so there must be all distortions of time in that scenario.
Yes, but yeah, that's true. That's true. There are. In fact, you can detect those changes with very accurate measurements of eclipses and what have you of the moons around Jupiter, for instance. It's a detectable mechanism. That's right. So there are several different ways you can get time dilation. Einstein's equations predict that if you expand space, so remember, God stretches out the heavens, so if you expand space, whatever exactly that might mean, you will also distort time. Gravity distorts time, and movement distorts time. So there are three different ways: gravitational, relativistic and cosmological. So God stretches out the heavens on day 4, so time at the outer edges of the cosmos would run much faster than clocks on the Earth. Now remember, the Bible is written from an Earth perspective. It's talking about Earth days. So on the 4th day of creation, God stretches out the heavens. Clocks at the outer edges could be running a trillion times faster as that process happens. So this is what it might appear like. Day 4 on Earth, the clocks are ticking at normal rate. In the cosmos, going very, very fast. After day 4, and it was so, presumably that stretching is finished, the clocks are running at approximately the same speed. Now, some people believe the universe is continuing to expand. It certainly appears that way. Some cosmologists, by the way, don't believe that's the case. They think there's something else happening, causing the redshifts. But let me just run this little animation and give you something of an idea of what it might have been like with this time dilation. So here you have God stretching out the heavens on day 4. You can see the cosmic clock at the bottom going very, very fast. The Milky Way with Earth in it, somewhere near the centre of all of that. And now 6,000 years later, the clocks are running at about the same pace because that rapid stretching out process has presumably finished. So another way of looking at it is you have the sun, moon and stars. God stretches it all out. The reference point being the Earth, clocks are ticking at a normal rate. Things that are not too far from us will have some acceleration, but at the edges of the cosmos you'll have clocks ticking very fast. So it provides a possible mechanism by which you can have a clock on the Earth going through one day, but at the Large Magellanic Cloud, for instance, running through 170,000 years, or in the Andromeda Galaxy ticking through 2.5 million years, which would also enable us, therefore, to see things like supernovas happening and so on. So that would give sufficient time then for the light to reach the Earth, so that on the evening of day 6, as Adam and Eve looked up at the stars, presumably holding hands, there's a plausible mechanism there for how this, in fact, might have worked. Now, I say a plausible solution because there are others that address this problem using relativistic approaches like that one. But the point to also bear in mind, and by the way, we're not saying that is the solution, that has got problems with it that others are still working on. It's important to remember that the secularist has a very big light travel time problem, all of their own, which you don't hear much about. And the problem is this: it's called the cosmic background radiation. And this is like the heat distribution of the outer atmosphere, which is outer cosmos, which is believed to be the sort of afterglow, if you will, of the Big Bang. Now, before this was accurately measured, it was assumed that there would be hot regions and cold regions. The hot regions corresponding to where galaxies would then subsequently condense and form. The colder regions would be where there was more empty space. When various satellites did measurements of this, and in particular the Planck telescope about 10 years ago, it revealed that the temperature was incredibly uniform, almost exactly the same. It differed only 1 part in 100,000. Now that's a very small variation. If you're thinking of it in terms of, say, a flat surface, that's like 1 millimetre variation over 100 metres, right? Almost exactly uniform, which was a big surprise. That was not predicted from the Big Bang Theory. So here's the problem. The temperature has to be equalised through radiative transfer of heat, because there's no conduction mechanisms available in space. So the hot regions have to get their heat to the cold regions to bring them up into to a thermal equilibrium. But the problem is there's been insufficient time for the heat to go from one side of the universe to another to secure this incredible uniformity of the Big Bang, incredibly early on, I might add. There was a thing called the inflation period, and I've got the numbers somewhere here. It occurred, I've got them on the next slide, I think, but it's something like 10 to the minus 30 something of a second, almost unthinkably short interval of time. And the universe expanded by many, many orders of magnitude at a speed way, way faster than the speed of light. And then it's continued on with its expansion, and there seems to be an acceleration in that expansion that's recently been measured. So this little cartoon, I think, includes it very well. Alan Guth was published in Discover magazine, and he said the universe burst into something from absolutely nothing, zero, nada. And as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere. He actually wrote this, right? I mean, this is not really science, is it? This is belief. They're trying to solve this problem. How come the background is so stable? The universe grew a million times larger in 1,000 million millionth of a second, which blows the mind of this little cartoon. The guy says, let me get this straight. First there was nothing and then it exploded. So that is, I think, really storytelling. That's not actually science. The problem is that this inflationary period began for no reason, ended for no reason, and during it you had special physics where matter repelled matter instead of attracting matter as it does now. I just want to play this little clip out of our video called Evolution's Achilles Heels.
Many people say that creationists have an issue with light travel. That is, how can we see light from distant stars when the Earth is only 6,000 years old? But the Big Bang, in fact, has its own light travel problem. This has to do with the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is supposedly the afterglow of the Big Bang, and which has been observed to have a very uniform temperature no matter where you look in space. And there just hasn't been enough time for the energy to be transferred across space to make all this temperature uniform to the extent that it is. And that's called the horizon problem.
Now, there was an interesting explanation or attempt to find a solution to this, and it's called the inflationary period. So some incredibly short instant after this initial Big Bang, the universe expanded by massive orders of magnitude, and then somehow this period of inflation, as it's called, stopped. So it starts for no particular reason, and it stops for no particular reason. And by the way, during it, gravity has to work in reverse. So rather than matter being attracted to matter, it has to repel it. And so there's this amazing story is told to try and patch up this glaring problem that the Big Bang has.
The inflation proponents have no good physical model for this fast of a light expansion. It's a fudge factor. But the Bible teaches several times that God stretched out the heavens. The uniformity of background temperature is consistent with the universe being upheld by a single creator outside time and space. Furthermore, it's not just a God did it explanation. Creationist physicists have developed multiple competing models of this expansion using Einsteinian general relativity.
Okay, so on the DVD, Evolution's Achilles Heels, it goes into a bit more detail and so on on those particular issues. So, to summarise it, everyone believes in miracles. Right? We believe in miracles. We believe that the universe was spoken into being by the Creator God. The atheist believes in miracles. He has to believe that nothing became everything all by itself. But a miracle with a miracle worker, God, is a logical construction. But to believe a miracle without a miracle worker is actually to believe in magic. So I think that the biblical creationist has a much stronger position than does the evolutionist in trying to explain the existence of the universe. Now, you might think that all the secular scientists are of one accord with regard to the Big Bang, but that is absolutely not true. That's how it's presented in the TV documentaries, the public science material. There's a large group of people who, in fact, dissent from the Big Bang, and this was an open letter published in New Scientist. I just want to quote a couple of sections from it. It's signed by hundreds of PhD scientists. The Big Bang theory relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things that we have never observed. Now remember what we talked about, what science was? Science is about observation, right? You've got to be able to observe. If you can't observe it, then you're not doing science, you're actually doing philosophy. You're putting forward theories, ideas, principles, but it's not science. Things that we have never observed. Inflation, dark matter and dark energy are the most prominent. Without them, there would be fatal contradictions between the observations made by astronomers and the predictions of the Big Bang theory. So what's happening here is the Big Bang theory predicts certain things, that's not what's observed, something completely different is, so they invent something, a band-aid if you like, to save the Big Bang. It gets an added bit, patched. In no other field of physics would this continual recourse to new hypothetical objects be accepted as a way of bridging the gap between theory and observation. Now think about that. In no other field of physics would it be acceptable. It would at least raise serious questions about the validity of the underlying theory. What is more, the Big Bang theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation. Now, have you heard that on a TV documentary? I'll bet you haven't. Think about it. The Big Bang theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation. So why would we persist with a theory that is so poor? It goes on and says, the successes claimed by the theory supporters consist of its ability to retrospectively fit observations with a steadily increasing array of adjustable parameters. And I like this little quote. It was not part of that letter, it's from something else. And the guy was saying that in an article, he said, you have to understand that first there is speculation, then there's wild speculation, and then there's cosmology. Like I said, a bit tongue-in-cheek. Okay, then we had a question, no we didn't, not on Cain's wife. Anyone want to know who Cain's wife was?
Who's Cain?
Oh, well.
The person who's married to Cain's wife.
It's interesting, this question comes up in the answers book. It's amazing how often the question comes up. He's Adam and Eve's son. And people say, well, who married his son then? There are no other people around, right? Can't be. So who did Cain marry? If there were only Adam and Eve in the beginning, who did their children intermarry? Isn't that incest? And what about genetic defects? Wow, pretty big point, isn't it? Who was Cain's wife? Well, who did Abraham marry? Anybody know?
Half-sister.
What was her name?
Sarah.
Sarah originally got renamed her to Sarah, extremely high. So where did the defects come from? Well, they're mutations, they're accidental letter changes in the DNA, which we talked about yesterday. In Romans 8 we read that the whole of creation is in bondage to decay, so things are running down, not getting better, and mutations have accumulated since the fall. Now this was not a problem by the time of Abraham, that was about 2,000 years after the creation. But by the time of Moses, another 500 years later, mutations are starting to become a significant problem. So God, in his mercy, gives the people a law. Don't marry close relatives because it's not going to go well for you. But you see, up until then, there was no problem. Adam and Eve, of course, had perfect genes, didn't they? So they start off with perfect genes, they rebel against God, and then the constant running down commences. So by the time you get to the time of the law, 2,500 years later, then it's a significant problem. So there's no genetic issue, and by the way, the law against close intermarriage was not given until then. So if it's not a law, it's not a sin to have close intermarriage beforehand. So why not marry a sibling today? God prohibited it 3,500 years ago. A baby born to siblings will have a 6% chance of inheriting a pair of just one defective gene present in one grandparent. So it gets to be a significant risk, and multiple mutant genes multiplies the likelihood of this happening. So, can you marry a relation? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? Who thinks possibly?
I'm going to go yes, but not close.
Sorry?
Depending on your definition of a relation. How close?
Well, maybe it's only up to counselling. If you don't marry a relation, you don't get married.
Yeah.
You think about it. Adam and Eve are our original parents. We have all descended from them. We are all part of the one human family. So the question is exactly right, Ian, is how
I think
closely intermarried.
third cousins can legally marry.
I'm not sure what it is.
I can't remember what the exact figure is.
Okay, now, there was a question that came up last night that I think Hannah raised about fossil record. I did cover this off in the biology talk. I don't think you were here for that, though, Hannah, so let me just run through a couple of slides to talk about the fossil record. We've often seen this kind of thing. We have all the millions of years down the side and the arrangement of fossils, and it shows this general progression from various sea creatures all out to vertebrate mammals, the higher order mammals at the top, which is interpreted as being an example or an evidence of the evolutionary process. But here's an interesting quote. This is Charles Darwin. So he said, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection that can be urged against the theory." So he recognised that the fossil record did not support his theory, but he thought that the more fossils that were found, then it ultimately would. Now, 160 years later, a guy called Colin Patterson wrote a book on fossils. Someone wrote to him about that book. He wrote back and said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them." So this guy is senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He went on and said, "I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." Now that's very telling, isn't it? A senior paleontologist basically saying, well, actually, there aren't any transitional forms. But that's not what you hear about. It's not what you see in your biology textbooks. It's not what the TV documentaries, the popular press will tell you. But here are some illustrations. This is from the Chicago Field Museum. It shows the dinosaurs down there on the right-hand side and the fossil evidence, various pieces of fossil remains that have been found. You can see the assumed family tree of the dinosaurs, and these are the number of fossils found for each of those junctions in the family tree, and there's not a single one. There is no evidence for a common ancestor, only evidence for the different varieties of dinosaur that are out there. This is another one from Science Journal, a bit more detailed, but similar principle again, the different dinosaurs across the top, and it was an attempt to link them into various family groups, as you can see going backwards in time on the left-hand side. So we've identified in there the different bridges that were made, for which there's actually no fossil evidence, but if you take those bits away, the whole evolutionary tree actually disappears. So there's no evidence for that evolutionary tree. Yes?
I might have an uneducated thing, but I was just... So there's a land animal that they were able to track that had gone from land to the ocean, and then it was what became dolphins and stuff. Is that not a case of that?
What they think, all right? So you have to ask the question, what have they actually found? And people find various fossils and they link them together like that with assumed bridges. But there is no fossil evidence that actually shows you that progression. Interestingly, you see, people arrange fossils in different ways, and they say, look, you can see it goes from small to big, but you can rearrange them. I mean, an arrangement doesn't prove the theory. What's happening is they're using their belief about what happened to arrange the fossils consistent with what they believe. If you get onto our website, and actually in the answers book you'll find some examples. One of them is a guy, there's one called Pakicetus, and just escapes me for the moment. Rhodocetus, I think it is, one of the claimed ancestors of whales. And one of the books we have, not here, but on our website, is called Evolution, the Grand Experiment. And the guy who wrote that book went around and interviewed the scientists. And the one he interviewed, who had published this thing about Rhodocetus, actually admitted that the thing didn't have tail flukes at all. They just assumed that it would have had they found a complete skeleton, but they didn't. So there's a lot of assumptions are made, and it gives the impression that the whole evolutionary sequence is an established fact. But these guys are saying, well, if I knew of an example like that, I would have included it. And when you look at these fossils, you find that, in fact, there is no evidence of bridges. Yes, Byron?
You said earlier, I think, that the dinosaurs were like all died because of hunting. What about the small ones that come to Connecticut?
They didn't all necessarily die of hunting. I think the large ones would mostly have been hunted to extinction. But there are lots of mechanisms by which animals go extinct. Something like 90%, I think people estimate, of all the different kinds of animals that have ever existed are now extinct. There have been massive extinction episodes that paleontologists tell us, but I think let's just move on now, because we talked about the claimed ancestry of man and how man is supposed to have evolved. And today it's, well, in fact it was Charles Darwin who wrote this in his book The Descent of Man. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilised races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, instead of, as now, between the Negro or Australian, meaning the Aboriginal, and the gorilla. So Darwin made the suggestion that dark-skinned people were really only one step away from the apes. And that, in fact, has seeded a tremendous amount of racism in our culture. Now, you would have all seen that kind of classic icon of the ape evolving slowly into man, and all kinds of versions of it, but basically that's how it looks. And I want to run the video clip that I ran the other day, so apologies for those who've already seen it, but not all of you have. My colleague Scott Devlin put this little clip together to look at the evidence for that progression of human evolution.
You may recognise this image from school textbooks, t-shirts, soda adverts, and everything in between. But what if I were to tell you that if we're to be honest with the evidence that we have, this picture should look more like this? Let me explain. On the left is what is believed to be the first ape, known as proconsul, and on the right is a human called Homo sapiens. But what scientific evidence is there for everything else in this image? The transitional species. Let's find out. We'll start with Homo neanderthalensis. You might know him as Neanderthal man. Recent discoveries have shown that Neanderthal man made and wore jewelry, played instruments, used tools, and wore makeup. We've even found that his brain was the same or slightly larger than the average average human living today. In other words, Neanderthal man was actually just a man. What about Homo erectus? Recent discoveries have shown that Homo erectus made tools, engaged in artwork, spoke intelligent language, and made and sailed boats. In other words, Homo erectus was also just a man. Now we'll come back to Homo habilis in a moment, but first, let me show you something. Have you ever heard of Lucy, the most famous so-called ape man, paraded in our museums, one of the very first Australopithecus afarensis species ever to be found? But what does the evidence reveal? She had a skull that was sloped and ape-like, nothing like human skulls. Fingers that were curved, not at all like human fingers. Toes that were curved, not at all like human toes. Wrists that had the ability to lock for knuckle walking, and a knee structure that was compatible with life in trees. So Lucy and her kind swung from trees and looked like today's apes. Lucy is an extinct type of ape. As we've just seen, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal man, and Homo erectus were all men. Australopithecus afarensis and proconsul were both apes. Considering the ubiquity of the evolutionary icon, we'd really want to see some strong evidence for Homo habilis, the pivotal point of transition between stooped ape and upright man, between basic instinct and intelligent thought, between animal noise and intelligent speech. The only problem is, in the words of Ian Tattersall, Homo habilis is a wastebasket taxon, little more than a convenient recipient for a motley assortment of hominin fossils. Other scientists refer to him as a garbage bag because the bones we have for him are a mixture of human and ape bones. In other words, Homo habilis never existed. I think evolutionary professor Bernard Woods sums this up well. Our progress from ape to human looks so smooth, so tiny, with such a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let it go. But it is an illusion. With the lack of evidence and agreement on the ape-human transition forms, why is this not happening? All of this. And is a fair explanation that man and apes have always coexisted and reproduced according to their own kind, as stated in Genesis 1.
You can find that particular clip on our YouTube channel. You'll also find lots of information on the website. So you'll hear this claim often made that we're genetically very similar to the chimps, which is interpreted as meaning that we have a common ancestor somewhere back in the past. And we're less than 2% different, they say, yeah?
I'm pretty sure we have a lot of, there's like, I'm not sure of the percent, but we have like a lot of genetics the same with bananas, but
We do.
I don't think
We
that
do.
means that.
That's...
Hey, you speak
In fact, I've got
before you
there.
go any further.
Most of them are pretty banana shaped.
Most
Yeah.
of us do. No, actually, no. That makes sense for you.
It's about 50%
Most of us.
is the statistic. Thank you for saying that, because I was about to bring it up in the notes. But that's how it's interpreted, that's how it's presented. That we have such a high similarity, we must therefore have had a relatively recent common ancestor. Yes, Byron, you wanted to?
I think we are like that because I know
All right. Now, I know, we won't go anywhere near
We
that.
said I was like a banana.
There you go, Hannah.
Conscious when you sleep tonight, she knows
So,
who you are.
Hannah, you're ahead of me. I had it on the slide. Okay, similarities are evidence of common design, I think, not common ancestry. You see, the designer solved a particular problem and repeated the design feature many times. Now, you can look at, say, an old VW with a rear engine, horizontally opposed air-cooled engine. Then you look at a Porsche, rear engine, four-cylinder engine, horizontally opposed air-cooled. Why are they the same? They had the same designer, Dr. Porsche. So similarities are often evidence of a common designer. Doesn't mean that the Porsche evolved from the VW, right? Okay, so even if it was only 2%, that's still an amazing number of bits of information, letters, if you like. Just hang on, we'll get the end of this and we'll come back. So you're looking at something like 60 million base pairs of information, even if it was only 2%. But there's a thing called the waiting time problem that was, I recognise quite a few decades ago. It's called Haldane's Dilemma for another title. And this is it. It would take 84 million years, this is based on mathematical modelling, to get just 2 base pairs lined up together in the DNA. And yet we are supposed to have separated from our common ancestor with chimps just 7 million years ago. And we're trying to reach 60 million pairs. It's going to take us 84 million years to get 2. I mean, it's completely impossible. Human evolution is an impossible story. Now, a very revealing little video clip was put out by a secular group that's doing genetics education for kids, and it's really good. So I just want to run this little clip where they admit to how they got this high level of similarity. Let's have a listen.
When researchers sat down to compare the chimp and human genomes, those single-letter differences were easy to tally, but the big mismatch sections weren't. For example, if a genetic paragraph, thousands of letters long, appears twice in the human scroll, but only once in its chimp counterpart, should that second human copy count as thousands of changes, or just one? And what about identical paragraphs that appear in both genomes, but in different places, or in reverse order, or broken up into pieces?
I call that manipulating the data, right? You've got to ignore 18% of the chimp DNA and 25% of ours, and then you can get a 98% comparison. So it's pretty stunning stuff. I think that whopping 1.3 billion letters which have been conveniently omitted. So it doesn't, I guess what I'm pointing out here is that in order to promote the paradigm, people take some pretty big liberties with how they present the general data. So the mere fact that you see that kind of statistic which doesn't tell you the truth about what's omitted is, I think, quite revealing. So when we look at the fossil record in this chart, and we can look at more detail, but I won't for the moment, it actually, I believe, is best interpreted as the order in which things were buried as a result of the flood. So why are the higher order mammals at the top? They would have been able to escape for longer. And they would have been the most recent buried bodies. But then, remember we talked this morning about the continents rising up and the waters flowing off. The first thing eroded was the most recently laid levels, which would have had the majority of the vertebrate fossils. All get swept off the continents and dumped into the continental margins. So the fossil record is predominantly marine and invertebrates, and a very small percentage is vertebrates. And that's consistent with what you would expect again with a flood where the waters rose for 5 whole months before they reached their peak and then began to flow off the land. Now, someone asked about continental drift.
You were going to come back to...
Oh, yes, I was.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I forgot the question.
Sorry. It might come back. Okay, hang in there.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry. I was a little bit confused. So are you saying that because of the evolution theory, that was where racism evolved from? Because
No.
No.
Racism has been around ever since year dot.
I feel like the evolution theory is inspired because of racism, rather than
It could be. It could be.
Could be.
But you've got to remember, Charles Darwin was the one who wrote down, he thought that the Negro and the Australian Aboriginal were in fact one step removed from gorillas. And that really has been the scientific excuse for racism.
Yes, but I also believe that it was a common belief, like the
Common problem
people
before
that
that.
weren't white were less than other people before even that.
I don't think it was so much colour-based, it's more power-based.
Yeah.
The people group that has more power than another people group will enslave them. In fact, slavery, if you look back at the history of it, there was, I haven't got the numbers off the top of my head, but I have actually got a talk on racism there was more slavery of black people enslaving whites than the other way around. The word slave, in fact, comes from Slav, which was a people group in Europe who were heavily oppressed and were almost always in slavery to the Moors and the Muslim dark-skinned people who lived in the Middle East. So it's really a question of one people group being more powerful than another, rather than colour specifically. But general differences, sorry, I should be using that. People, instead of waving around, people tend to, instinctively like to group together. And if someone's different, it's hard for that different person to break into a group.
Yes, but wouldn't that kind of also kind of prove my point that it could have been based on a belief of that of a European culture?
I'm not saying racism wasn't around before Darwin, it certainly was, but as one scientist said, the discrimination increased by orders of magnitude after the theory of evolution was published by Darwin.
Can I just break in? What he's saying is that racism was a problem, pre-existed Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, by saying that lot and that lot, they're almost just monkeys,
Yes.
actually made it worse, not better. That's all he's saying.
Yes, I understand what you're saying.
Cool. Can I have your animal?
No.
I really love
But what's interesting, let me just say this and I need to move on. Of late, you would have been aware of things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the cancel culture which is around.
Yep.
People have been toppling statues of people involved in slavery because the argument is it's slavery which is the root of racism. But actually, in our culture today, the driver of racism is actually an acceptance of evolutionary theory. That is what actually drives it. But do you notice no one's toppling Darwin's statue? Interesting, isn't it? Okay, continental drift, just quickly. The Bible talks about the flood, we've covered before, the springs of the great deep bursting forth. I touched on this a day or so back, and how the structure of the earth now has these continental plates, which at the onset of the flood could have been fractured, and then this runaway process taking place with one plate sliding under another, releasing all this magma and volcanic eruptions on a global scale. You'll find information about it on our website. But what's really interesting is that the Bible says, and just interesting confirmation of this. This is an image which, as I think published by NASA, that looks at the seismology which has revealed large cold slabs of rock deep down near the core mantle boundary of the Earth. It does have a name. You can find it, you just Google it and you'll discover it in the general science literature. And scientists are perplexed about this because if the Earth is as old as it's claimed to be, you can't have cold rock down there. It would have reached an equilibrium of temperature long, long since. So it looks like this stuff has been driven down into the core, through the mantle down towards the core mantle boundary, and there is still a significant temperature difference. Now that stacks up with the model of the runaway plate tectonics thing that I had there before. Quite interesting. But the Bible says in Genesis 1:9, let the water under the sky be gathered in one place and let the dry ground appear. So it suggests that there was one ocean and one landmass. That's what we read about in Genesis 1. Now, geologists have looked at probably geologists I guess, at the different layouts and have figured out that you could sort of fit the continents together a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, you know. And so this is the things that came out of one of the US research groups in geology. So down the bottom I've got their assumed time scale, and you'll notice it's all measured in millions of years, and that's based on rates that are measured today. Right? No one observed this. These are rates measured today, and they wind them backwards. It's called uniformitarianism. Now, we had some written questions, and sorry about that. Let me try and hold this at the same time as read them. So a bunch of questions. Let me try and get through these quickly. What are your degrees in? I have a science degree and an engineering degree with honours and a Doctor of Philosophy in electromagnetics, all from Sydney University. I also have a diploma in biblical studies, which I tend not to put up on the screen, but
Sorry,
maybe I should.
was that a doctorate in philosophy or philosophical electronics? I didn't quite catch that.
A Doctor of Philosophy is a research degree,
Uh-huh.
and the discipline in which I did it was electromagnetics, Maxwell's equations in an engineering sense, and then applied to the design of antennas, which opened the door for me to get into the aerospace industry, designing spacecraft.
Can you repeat the question down there, because some of it's...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so, well, I read that question now. Okay, I should have repeated
I
it.
added
Sorry.
an extra bit. Sorry, Dave.
He was just confused, he was asking for clarification, I think.
The question is just what my degrees are. What evidence do you have for creationism that areas have been proven through the scientific method? This is a good question. Remember we talked about the different sorts of science, operational science or experimental science based on observable, repeatable experiments. And then there's historical science, where scientists observe things in the present and then make up a story to explain what happened in the past. But the past is unobserved. So, in that sense, the scientific method is not applicable to the study of origins because you can't conduct experiments on origins. All you've got is today's data. So what scientists do is to build a model of what they think happened, and then you test the model against observations that you can make in the present. So what I've been doing through these talks this weekend is showing you that observations that can be made in the world around us don't fit the evolutionary model, right? They're not stacking up. And in fact, they fit much better with the biblical model. And the reason I think is obvious, because the biblical model is the truth. It's God's eyewitness account of what actually happened. So you could expect that what we see in the world around us is consistent with the truth. But if you make up a story about our origins that starts by assuming there's no God, and you get this whole edifice which includes deep time, all the millions and millions of years, and then you start looking at processes that happen way too quickly, then something is missing. So what happens, as in the Big Bang, scientists add to the model various corollaries. It's like putting band-aids on it. They invent different things that could happen, like the inflation period, dark matter and dark energy are similar things which have never been observed. So if things have never been observed, then they're not actually part of science. Right? They're philosophical. You're dealing with someone's concept or model. So in a real sense, there is no evidence for evolution or for creation that is subject to the scientific method. But what you can do is observe things in the world around us and see if they fit the predictions of either model. And that's basically what I've been doing. And you might remember that I've often used the term, the evidence that we can see is consistent with the Bible's record of history, but it's not consistent with the evolutionary story. You've made points about scientists only including data or evidence that supports their theories. However, the scientific evidence included in this PowerPoint only supports the idea of creationism.
I think it was meant to be a question.
Sorry?
I think I meant to word it as a question.
How did you want to word that differently?
Well, as a question, but...
Yeah.
Well, what I'm doing is presenting to you information that I don't believe you'll hear anywhere else. You see, you won't hear the things I'm talking about from the school curriculum. You won't hear about it in university courses. You won't hear about it on TV documentaries, because that all pushes the accepted paradigm in our culture. So if somebody takes a position contrary to the paradigm, they get silenced. Actually, it's extremely difficult. That's why our ministry exists, to publish material, put out videos, DVDs that point to the flaws in the evolutionary model and point to how the evidence actually is consistent with the Bible, encouraging people to have confidence that it really is God's word. So that's really what we're trying to do through this. I hope that helps. Would the ash layers not suggest a meteor or some sort of catastrophic event to wipe out the dinosaurs? Well, yes, you're partly right. The meteor thing is the current accepted theory. Let me just bring up that illustration that I had in one of the talks, if I can just remember which one it was, where I showed the different layers of the rocks just south of where I live in Sydney. Is that the one? There it is. So you can see all those different layers, and they're interspersed. They're coal-bearing layers interspersed with ash layers which speak of successive volcanic eruptions. Now, each of those layers probably corresponds to a massive tsunami that would have rolled across the land and brought tremendous destruction, sweeping much of the vegetation ahead of it, dumping it, burying it. Someone also asked about how much pressure there would be. These rock layers are quite deep, and in Grand Canyon, those sedimentary layers are like 2 kilometres deep, so there's enormous weight of rock is placed there, so great pressures are involved here. But it speaks of successive events rather than necessarily one happening all at once just like that. The Bible says that the waters took 5 whole months to reach their zenith on the earth. And a lot of evidence suggests that it came in successive waves, wave after wave after wave. In fact, on a lot of these boundary layers, people are finding dinosaur nests and dinosaur eggs that look as though they've been very hastily laid. Often in a crisis situation, animals will lay eggs or do something in a sort of instinctive process to try and preserve their kind. But then, not long after that, in comes another wave, dumps a whole bunch of sediment all over the top of that. So it looks like it was successive waves. Now, you've got to remember, we're looking at the evidence in the present. The Bible gives us some information, but not a lot, about the exact nature of what happened in the flood. And what we see in the evidence around us is consistent with what the Bible says, and we try and build models of what might have actually happened. But you can't be dogmatic about them. Once again, we didn't witness it, but you see the results of a massive watery catastrophe on a global scale, which is consistent with what the Bible says. And there's no mechanism that we observe today that is depositing massive sheets of sedimentary rock. Some of the sedimentary megasequences are half the size of the US. Nowhere on the face of the earth is something that big being deposited that deep and rapidly. It's a process which is just not happening today. You can't observe it. So something catastrophic happened in the past. Not consistent with that uniformitarian philosophy, but very consistent with what the Bible says. Would large quantities of coal also not suggest...
Same kind of question.
Sorry?
I think it's just the same kind of question.
Same kind of question?
I didn't proofread it that much.
Okay. Why does only scientific evidence included either support creation or is it able to be disproven? There's a lot of solid evidence for evolution, such as observed as the microevolution in a lab, fly populations and green tree frogs in Chernobyl evolving more melanin in their skin to combat radiation. Let me just touch quickly on this thing about adaptation, which is talked about as microevolution. And I did cover this in the biology talk, but let's just touch on it again quickly because it's important as a concept. So, remember I was talking about how to go from a simple organism to a complex organism. You have to add genetic information. You have to produce legs where there were no legs or eyes where there were no eyes before. So somehow or other, as you climb up this supposed evolutionary tree, you've got to add more and more genetic information. Now, the information is like computer code. It's intelligible, it's intelligent stuff, which hopefully works. David's thinking, no, it often doesn't work, but you've got to work hard and make computer code work, right? And it's got to be right. So one of the mechanisms that was put forward, and Darwin, of course, was the primary advocate for this, was natural selection. But I want to show you how natural selection actually works. This is quite important. And I'm going to use two little dogs here as my illustrations, right? And these dogs have medium length hair. So let's imagine that they have medium length hair because their hair length is determined by just two genes, one for short hair, one for long hair. So if they're codominant, they will have medium length hair. Now there's a number of different ways you can get puppies from these two dogs. The first little guy, he inherits the short-haired gene from each of his parents. So he's got very short hair, right? The next two are like his parents. They get a long and short-haired gene each. So they have medium length hair each. And this little guy gets the jackpot. He gets the long-haired gene from both parents, right? So he's a very hairy little dog. Now let's imagine that population of dogs ends up in a cold place where there's lots of ice and snow and sleet. The short and medium length haired dogs will be selected against by the environment. And before long, they're going to die out. But the warm ones, they'll survive. Now those two happen to fall in love. They're going to produce a bunch of puppies. But guess what? Every single one of them will have long hair. But can you see why? Because the genes for making medium and short hair has been lost. It's not there anymore in the population. So what natural selection is doing is actually going downhill. It's reducing the genetic information within the population. Or at the very best, it might rearrange it, but it never increases it. You think about it, the word selection means that it selects from pre-existing information. Nothing new is created. So natural selection is a conservative process, not a creative one. Yes?
Isn't the idea of natural selection part of the evolution theory though too?
Yeah, that's the proposed mechanism is that there's some form of genetic change and that leads to an organism which is better suited to the environment, so it produces more offspring, and that is then how the upward climb, that's the natural selection process that is supposed to happen. And it does happen, but it happens downhill, not uphill. That's the difference.
But say there's a kangaroo that has developed the ability to actually go into trees and go eat plants and stuff. Wouldn't that be like gaining more traits to better suit that environment?
But what about if there's no trees? Then they're going to die out, right?
Actually, I've heard this one before, was that there were both tree kangaroos, because there are still kangaroos that climb trees. Some in Papua New Guinea, I believe, and in northern Australia, there are kangaroos that do go up trees. At some point, the kangaroo kind have the ability to go up trees, run along the ground, all the rest of it. Depending on where they were growing up, they may have had the need to do one or the other, but natural selection will weed out the ones not suited to their environment that they're in.
But I thought they had different features as well to help support those.
Well, you can have different features, but they can come about by selecting different parts of the genome. For instance, if you think about human beings, some of us have very angular eyes, for instance. Asian people, typically. Some have very dark skin, people who came from people groups that lived in the equatorial regions. So there's been adaptation. Don't confuse adaptation with so-called upward evolution. It's not the same thing. Adaptation and natural selection are in fact downhill processes.
I'm pretty sure this is simplifying it like a lot. Because,
oh, that's simplified, of course.
Well, because a lot of the time it wouldn't be, because like the long hairiness and stuff, it's not just one gene or one.
Yeah. It's more complex than that, but I'm illustrating the
principle. There
principle.
would still be the recessiveness, so if there was enough recessive genes still in one of the dogs, then it would be able to breed with another dog with recessive genes, so they'd still be able to be short-haired dogs.
Yeah, but you can breed dogs all you like, you're never going to get a cat. Ever. Because you're crossing the boundary of whatever would have been a kind. So enormous variation within the genome. You see, that reflects the genius of the creator. Because when he wrote the original DNA code for each kind, it was built in with enormous amount of redundancy. because then creatures could survive in widely different environments. If God hadn't done that, the slightest change in the environment would have led to the extinction of basically all the animals. Yes, Byron?
Is it natural selection like one dog is dumb and one dog is smart? And then the dumb dog goes and swims while he doesn't know how to swim against the earth, and the smart dog doesn't swim because he doesn't know how to, and then it makes it so the smart dog is smart. You're the dumb dog.
Well, it's smart and dumb dogs. It's not really the point. The point I'm trying to make here is that there is no novel genetic information produced through natural selection. You select what is already there. But for evolution to work, you have to generate novel genetic information, which was not there before. And that has to be like computer code. It has to work, it has to be read by the cellular machinery to build the right proteins, to go to the right places, to make legs where there were no legs, eyes where there were no eyes, right? All that sort of stuff. But we never ever see that. It's never illustrated in observable science. But adaptation is, and loss of genetic information is, like blind fish in caves, for instance. They don't need eyes. Get a few mutations and before long they've ended up without eyes. But there's no advantage to them to having eyes. So it's an adaptation, but not new information. Yep.
What about the frogs who live around Chernobyl and they have adapted to
The
have
melanin?
melanin in it?
They just produce more melanin. It's already there in the genome. Now the mechanism is switched on and amplified so that they get lots and lots of melanin. And that's how they've survived. I think I gave an illustration previously on, I don't know if it's here, yes I did. This is another example. Beneficial mutations are often confused for information increasing mutations. Like the little beetles on a windy island, the ones that don't have wings, survive. If they had wings, they'll fly, get blown off the island and drown. And you find this, and on the mainland, the same beetle, which has wings, chiefly exists and flies about, but they don't have wings on the island. So you can say, oh, well, that's a beneficial mutation, which it is, but it's not an increase. It's still a loss of information. You cannot produce novel information. Information only comes from a mind. Someone has to think about information and then write it. Yes?
What about when there's a mutation that acts to the genetic code, such as when the
Mutations? Yeah, well that's...
transcribes and translates wrong, and so that adds to the genetic code. Would that not be an addition of information?
So mutations are the second mechanism that is proposed, but look at what the scientists themselves say. This is Carl Sagan, and he says mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It's rare that a precision machine is improved by a random change in instructions for making it. You ever noticed when you go to the dentist and they x-ray you? They leave the room. Why do they leave the room? They don't want to be irradiated by x-rays. Why? Because it damages their DNA. Now, if this was a good thing, they'd all be standing around the x-ray machine. Maybe I'll produce some kind of a mutant version of some massive athlete or something. I'm being a bit facetious, but you know what I mean. See, mutations are copying mistakes. If I wrote that simple sentence and made some mistakes, have I added information? Well, no. Errors almost always delete or corrupt information. Random copying errors cannot account for the encyclopedic quantities of new information needed to go from simple organisms to complex ones. And I use this example in the talk, the TNR mutant. Now, the information for making feathers has been switched off. It's actually in the DNA, but the mechanism that triggers the manufacture has failed because of a mutation. And I made the joke that, the farmer would probably think it's a fantastic mutation, now he doesn't have to pluck the chooks. But if you're the little chook, you'd have a different view, wouldn't you? Now, that's called the TNR mutant, which actually stands for totally naked rooster. Scientists are not particularly creative sometimes. But mutations are almost always harmful. Look at what they do to creatures.
Makes a bigger strawberry.
It's a mutant strawberry, it's a big one. But I don't know what else it's done to it, but the other things are pretty horrible, right? And that led us on to that one. So the thing is that mutations don't increase information, they delete it. Right? They just delete it. And I asked the question during that talk, does anyone know what the third proposed mechanism is for increasing genetic information through natural processes? What do biologists now propose? Nothing. They've got no suggestion. And it's not as though the scientists don't know this, but it's not made public because it goes all the wrong way. And I shared this video clip, and let me do it again because it's good. Professor Dawkins was asked this question: can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome? Right? Now, this has to be a fundamental part of the evolutionary story. So an expert like Dawkins would surely have stacks of examples to give. So watch how he responds.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Okay, so the world's greatest advocate for evolution has got nothing to say. It actually is worse than that. You can look at that video clip in full on our website, From a Frog to a Prince, the video is called. He came back on after that and answered a question other than the one that had been asked. And he was asked in an interview, has evolution been observed? And his answer was, evolution has been observed, it's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. You know, need to think about that. It's not a good answer, is it? In fairness to Dawkins, what he means is that the processes are usually so slow you don't see it in one lifetime. But that actually isn't the case, because there are many rapid adaptations that are happening, which people say, wow, look how fast that change occurred in this population of insects or whatever. So Paul Davies sums it up: there is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Now, I want to just touch on these and then we'll finish. You mentioned that the fossils are caused by southern sediment, but is it true that there has to be pressure too? And if so, how is there pressure happening in the floodwater that moves sediments as it goes? I think I've sort of covered that. The depth of the sediments is very great, and so there would indeed be substantial pressure exerted on the fossils. And it was probably tsunami after tsunami rolling across the surface of the land. Yes, Andrew?
First, I want to thank Dr. Mark. It's not easy. I think it's need courage to raise that, or giving. Sorry, English not very good. Giving that information which is against almost the rest of the world. I think need a lot of courage and then really help us to know more about God. And let's just thank Mark first, and then my question is in which situation do you think the theory is a lot? I really appreciate it, super complete with all the perspective from biology, from is it called archaeologists, all those and geology, and then my question is, in which situation do you think the theory of the rest of the world can be true, and then in which situation will you think, for example, they are both true? For example, the theory of the natural selection can be both true with God, or maybe partially true, or when will you think it? Because I was imagining I'm going to take this message and then share with my friend who maybe are atheists, and then how am I going to say that? And then, so I think that question could be very important for them.
Okay, it is a good question. How do you use this material when sharing with other people? I think the primary objective that I'm trying to achieve here is to encourage you all to have complete confidence in God's Word. That when the Bible says at the beginning that God created in 6 days, that's what he did. Now, I've explained several times why that is important. A lot of people think it's irrelevant. But if God took millions of years, and I'll talk about this tomorrow morning, then God created a world full of suffering and death and misery, which is not a good God. So it strikes at the character of God. So when I was growing up as a young Christian, I believed that God must have used evolution to create, which left me very confused. I couldn't figure out why Jesus had to die for me. You know, I thought, wow, why couldn't you just lived a good life and shown us how to relate to our Heavenly Father and then been transfigured up into heaven? Why the cross? Because I didn't get that God created a perfect world and we messed it up. That's why Paul said the last Adam came to fix up what the first Adam broke. Okay, so it strikes at understanding the gospel. So if we as Christians understand the gospel, if we understand that the observable evidence in the world around us supports the truth of this book, we will have great confidence when we're sharing our faith. Now, that doesn't mean you rock up to people and say, hey, guess what? Did you know the Earth's only 6,000 years old? Well, that's probably not a very wise method of opening your discussion on evangelism. But you probably wouldn't say, do you know a bloke who was dead for 3 days rose again? That's probably not a smart way to start either. Or, did you know a virgin conceived? My goodness, what a nutcase here. People move away. You see, we need wisdom. But it's being armed with the understanding that permits us to answer the questions that people have. Notice 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to every... Now that suggests you've been asked a question. Now when you're asked a question, be prepared to answer.
Oh, sorry, interrupted.
That's all right.
So in which situation or what degree do you think all the theory, just say natural selection, do you think it's 100 wrong or like 1% correct? Or like in which situation or what happened where you say it's true or 30% true?
Natural selection is an observable phenomenon. It actually happens. Right? That's observable science. No one doubts that. The question is, does it support the evolutionary story or does it support the creation account in the Bible? Now, I think it does the latter, but we're taught in our school system that it does the former. Right? So if someone were to, in conversation, say, oh, look, it's an amazing little creature in this article in the newspaper, incredible, it's evolved this ability to do such and such. Now, that might be a good opportunity to say, oh, how did that happen? How did the new genetic information arise? Just ask questions, get people to think. You know, when Jesus was asked things, he often replied with a question. So questioning is a good strategy. Get other people to speak and say what they believe. And that could open a door for you then to say, well, you know, actually, natural selection has never been shown to add genetic information. Did you know that? No? Yeah. And then you can give an example.
So do you think those things maybe can be both true? Is it possible?
Are you saying that creation and evolution?
No, I mean like,
no?
I just used natural selection as an example. I think maybe something in the middle, like will you think like they can be both true sometimes? Maybe, for example, we say, scientists say like a stone is 1 million years. Maybe God in the Bible means 1 year. In scientists' mind, is like thousands of years. Maybe the measurement was different. So that in that situation, they both can be true. So will that happen? For example, natural selection may be partially correct, and they both can be correct. Because it's too confident to tell people, hey, your theory is wrong. Like,
no, you don't do that. I'm not suggesting you do that. See, what I'm trying to say is you need to know that the Word of God is true. So if the genealogies in the Bible are true, and I believe they are because they're just listed in a very sober order, it's not poetry, it's just boring prose, right? This father begat that son, and he was that old when he did it, and bang, 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 all the way down. Those things are true. They're actual facts. So hang on to what you know is the truth. It doesn't mean that you have to confront that at every. Pretty keen on supper.
As well.
And the last question was, how do we know who wrote Genesis and how long after the creation of the earth did he live to witness it? Well, he didn't witness it because the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were either written or edited by Moses. So you're talking about 2,500 years after the creation before Moses comes. But how to answer that challenge? Just over.
Moses had regular dialogue with God.
He did. So there's a lot of interaction, but he also would have had the documents, and God inspired him to write what was necessary. And God, of course, wrote the 10 Commandments and gave him the law, which makes up a substantial part of the Pentateuch. We need to stop. Can we talk over supper?
Yeah.
Okay, I've gone too long. I'm sorry about that. I've tried to cover the questions. It's been a great session. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for engaging.